The Australian Financial Review.
Hello, I'm James Thompson, Senior Chanticleer columnist at the AFR. Welcome to our weekly news breakdown of all things business, finance and markets. With me today is not my Chanticleer colleague Anthony McDonald, but a man whose value is rising faster than Bitcoin. It's AFR Editor-in-Chief James Chessell. How are you, James?
James, it's been a huge week. I'm feeling a little bit more Dogecoin than Bitcoin, but I'm going to give it my best shot.
Fantastic. This week we take you inside the excitement, the drama and yes, the glamour of the Australian Financial Review's Business Person of the Year Awards. We look at the corporate sector's angst over an economy that's in reverse and examine Commonwealth Bank's uncharacteristic political blunder. James, let's start there. Commonwealth Bank shares have been on a staggering tear this year, and CEO Matt Comyn is the corporate sector's voice of reason. Over a third of us call CBA their main bank. But this week, CBA made a rare misstep when it announced it would move a group of customers from a dormant product to a new one. Now, the new account has a lower monthly fee, but there was a catch. Customers would be charged $3 to take out cash at a branch. Cue talkback outrage, and Treasurer Jim Chalmers giving CBA a whack, declaring the fee unacceptable. CBA sort of backed down. The fee stands, but the bank will take more time and care to move customers to the new account to ensure they're not left worse off. James, what do we learn from this snafu?
We've learned a few things, James, I think. The first is that politicians love kicking banks. It's been a little bit more fashionable in recent months to kick supermarkets,
yes,
but bank bashing came back in vogue this week. A second thing we learned or were reminded about is that people are emotional about cash. Many people, including many listening to this podcast, probably don't use a lot of cash. But as you know, James, when you speak to people in the financial system and particularly people in the banking system, there's still a large number of Australians who have a very strong connection to cash, to physical branches, all of that kind of legacy infrastructure. And they don't take changes to that infrastructure lightly, and that's what we've seen play out. And then the final element, I think, James, to all of this is the name of the game for bank CEOs since the Hayne Royal Commission, whose annual report came out, would you believe, in February 2019, it's a long time ago now, has been to keep your head down, be generally supportive of the Treasurer, and keep your customers happy and let them worry about some other part of the business sector that's causing them problems. And what we saw this week, quite obviously, was a bank CEO in Matt Comyn who has overall done a very good job, and we'll talk about him later in terms of the Business Person of the Year. But, you know, I'm sure it's been a source of great frustration to him. His head now is above the parapet and he's received a lot of unwanted attention. Yeah.
There's one sort of bigger thing from this, James, that I thought was interesting, and there is actually sort of an interesting debate under all this. I mean, I agree with you. CBA completely stuffed up the communications here. What they were thinking, putting this out before Christmas and the Christmas before an election.
Not wise.
No, they just got that wrong. But there's sort of an interesting issue about that. We're always worrying about productivity, and rightly so. We'll get onto the GDP figures later. But the digitising the economy, digitising the banking sector is a productivity enhancer. It's a good thing. And yes, change is going to be difficult. You've got to bring people along with that change. You've got to make sure that the people who are most affected feel like they're included. And there's some equity issues to think about here too. Now, as you said, most of us don't use cash. And so we're effectively subsidising those who still want to use cash. Moving to a user pays system like CBA is suggesting, I can sort of see the point of that. And so can CBA because they're keeping this fee.
Yeah.
But it just worries me a bit. We just managed to turn this into a shrill sort of circus within literally 12 hours. How's it going to be when we try and discuss a really important technological change like moving to AI?
Well, one of the great themes of this year and previous years, unfortunately, has been a reluctance for governments to make hard decisions and to take long-term reforms. What we're talking about today is a very small piece in a larger puzzle, which you outlined really well, James, but we cannot as taxpayers, particularly in the midst of a cost of living crisis, and there's quite a lot of budgetary constraints on Australia, expect everything to stay the same. And the transition from a cash-based payment system to a digital payment system is inevitable. And I think there needs to be a greater level of understanding when participants make these decisions. I don't know if any listeners remember, it wasn't on many front pages. The AFR, of course, ran it on its front page, but there was a reasonably big story a little while ago about the company that transports cash around Australia, Armaguard, being in financial difficulty, and it effectively had to be bailed out. Now, there were some very sensible reasons for that to take place at the time. I'm sure you would agree, James. But at the same time, the economics of that business are just going to get harder and harder and harder until literally, and I mean, this is people in the system say that, until it is only people who are either in the drug dealing business or in the tax avoidance or tax evasion business that are using cash. That day will come, and we need to prepare for it rationally and sensibly.
We do like both of those groups to be on our front page too, where appropriate.
Yes, indeed. James, just quickly, you've been following the Cbus story closely on the podcast. On Tuesday, it was a big moment. We got an independent report into board governance by Deloitte, the professional services firm. What did that tell us?
Well, I think it told us sort of what we already knew, James, that the governance at Cbus just isn't quite where you'd expect of an organisation that's almost managing $100 billion, just knocking on the door of that. Simple things like when the directors do a self-assessment of their skills, they say, I'm an expert in this and I'm an expert in that. No one was actually validating any of that.
Yeah.
And when they declared themselves an expert, you're supposed to give evidence for that. Half the time they didn't do that. They didn't provide any of the evidence, and it sort of goes unchecked. These are little things, but they're sort of, you expect all the T's to be crossed and the I's to be dotted.
They add up, don't they, James?
Yeah, totally. And then the real controversy inside Cbus particularly is these partnership agreements they have with unions, including the CFMEU, whereby they pay them a certain amount of money and they get stuff out of it. Member-based services, finding lost super, helping members in various ways, growing the membership. Now, those deals are naturally controversial. Every time a Cbus official is up in front of Parliament or something, the coalition hammers these agreements. So you'd think, again, your scrutiny of these by the board would be tip-top. Turns out it's a bit lacking. There's not great documentation and transparency about how they assess the benefits that members get out of those arrangements. The Deloitte said the arrangements are fair enough, but you've got to do the hard work to make sure that you're quantifying them and justifying them and keeping them in focus. So I think this is just a bit more, James, of the broader theme here, that the super sector's got very large and it needs to catch up in other areas that are really important, like governance and administration.
And I think it's important, James, I agree with all that, to remember that we're talking about one of the larger funds here. Some of the criticisms directed at Cbus haven't necessarily been directed at some of the other funds. And I am reminded of the chair of Cbus's former Federal Treasurer, Wayne Swan, and we had him at our superannuation summit a few months ago.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember, James, but he was quite defensive about the criticism of Cbus at that time and basically gave a very rousing defence of the board and the ethics and the governance of the business. And he's had a torrid couple of weeks since then and had to apologise on a number of fronts. And I don't say this lightly, but I think there was a minor sense of hubris, I think, within the organisation in the lead up to this. And so hopefully they're reflecting on some of the findings and acting accordingly.
Yeah, and I think that'll go right across the sector. We want super's here to stay. We want the sector to be well managed and strong.
Yep.
And hopefully it won't just be Cbus reflecting on this. I think it'd be good if all super boards are going away and thinking, what do we need to tweak to make sure our governance is tip-top?
Yeah, agree.
Okay, James, let's move to our first topic. And this week, the good and the great of Australian business gathered in Sydney for what's becoming a really special night on the corporate calendar, the AFR Business Person of the Year Award. This year was extra special because our team of judges, who we're both part of, couldn't split two wonderful founder stories and decided on joint winners. The founders of Chemist Warehouse, Sam Gance, Jack Gance and Mario Verrocchi, and Robin Cooter, the founder of AirTrunk. James, we'll come to the big debate that we had over this inside the newsroom in a little bit.
Cannot wait.
But let's first take our listeners inside the ballroom at the Fullerton Hotel, where I was lucky enough to interview the winners on stage. Well, thanks for joining us, Jack and Sam. Cosy and James just mentioned a little bit about the start of your journey. Jack, you arrived in Australia at the age of 2, I think. Now, Chemist Warehouse has had an amazing story. You remember it was around this time last year. They did a deal to merge with the ASX-listed Sigma Healthcare. That deal's now been approved by the ACCC, and Chemist Warehouse will join the ASX next year with what looks to be a $30 billion valuation. And on Wednesday night, we got a little more about this incredible story. Jack and Sam's parents fled the Holocaust and made it to Melbourne, where they opened a milk bar, starting an incredible journey for these two guys in retail. Here's Sam Gance explaining the secret sauce of Chemist Warehouse.
I think from the very beginning, we've always focused on the most important aspect of our business, and that was the customer. And we used to sit in meetings, and what we always used to say was, what does the customer want? You know, not what we want and what our suppliers want. It was what the customer want. And that's been the source of our business philosophy probably from day one. We've been in business we're an overnight success. We've only been going for 52 years.
Now, James, it's pretty simple, but I reckon this is what great business people do. They make the very complex sound really easy.
They certainly do, and it's a complicated task in and of itself, ironically enough. But the clarity of thought and the clarity of purpose really struck me on the evening. I was also struck by the fact that Gance brothers and Mario have been in business for so long. So here's a clip, I think, that illustrates that, with Jack Gance explaining how their relationship works.
I think we've all got different strengths. I think that we recognise each other's strengths. We don't have job descriptions. We don't have roles. We basically do what has to be done. And we never, ever go to a vote. It's always been unanimous. The person that has, I think we say basically the person that yells the loudest wins.
It's a bit how like AFR Editorial Conference works, but
I
anyway.
wasn't going to say it,
yes. I needed to get in before you said it, James. Bit like you and I, these relationships go back several decades. In the case of Chemist Warehouse, more than 40 years. It's pretty amazing, isn't it, James?
Yeah. And how good was it? I mean, the Jack Gance, Sam Gance, Mario Verrocchi have been experts at staying below the radar. They never speak. And then suddenly we've got two of them on stage shooting the breeze.
I'm going to unashamedly geek out here. It was a really special moment. You could have heard a pin drop in the room. We had some really senior business people there. There was Seven Group CEO Ryan Stokes, CBA CEO Matt Common, and Cliff Obrecht, the founder of Canva. And they were all devouring every word that these old blokes had to say. It was really, really compelling. And as you say, the fact that they're not out there trumpeting their success very often made it all the more special.
Yeah, I just love it. I mean, I think Sam is 2 years younger than Jack, and he said, I'm younger and better looking. And you know, you could just get a little glimpse of the same jokes that have probably been told around the family table, but it's just great to see the vibe.
Yeah, agree.
James, let's hear from Robin Cooter, who listeners will remember did the deal of the year this year in September, selling AirTrunk for a staggering $24 billion to private capital giant Blackstone. And believe it or not, he had a great little story that involves this podcast. Well, Robin, I'd like to take you back for a moment. It's back to September. It's not too far back, but you've just done the deal of the year, sold AirTrunk for $24 billion. And you're doing what every great CEO should be doing on a Saturday morning. You're listening to the Chanticleer podcast. You're driving along with your kids. What was the word they used to describe your appearance, or when we talked about you on the Chanticleer podcast?
Slave.
Have you figured out what it means yet?
Yeah, I had to Google it. And apparently it's a slang for someone has done very well. So my kids are 14 and 12. I'll take that as a compliment. So
yep.
They're not easy to impress.
This was very amusing. He's a pretty down-to-earth guy, Robin. He loves the data center sector. He loves AirTrunk, but he's It was interesting to hear how he's not forgotten where he came from, turning up here at aged 18 with no money.
Yep.
And he's trying to impress that on his kids that, you got to keep working.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, one of the lovely things about hearing Robin speak was the sense of perspective he brings to it, the sense that while he has worked incredibly hard, and he's obviously a pretty intelligent human being, luck and circumstances have played a part of it, and he doesn't seem to have lost sense of that broader picture.
Yeah. He's also a man in a hurry. I mean, I think it was a couple of days after the deal, he's sold AirTrunk for $24 billion. And now he's gone, we want to get to $100 billion.
Well, not only that, James, I think he upgraded it halfway through his chat with you. But I agree, he's clearly got no time to waste. He wants to build a business, and in Asia, that was a key part of his story. So let's hear what he has to say about that.
One thing with our business is cloud doesn't sleep. So it's not like, you sort of done great things and you can have a holiday. The reality is, our customers, they are changing their forecast every week. So, we need to make sure if we want to be $100 billion business or even more, we need to make sure we can't drop the balls. We need to make sure, we are ready, how we can support our customer growth.
You reckon he could win this award again, James, if he actually hit that $100 billion? I reckon he's a chance.
That's a good question, James. I think he'd be every possibility. The rate of growth in that business is phenomenal. He has one of the world's most powerful and clever financial institutions in Blackstone backing him. All signs point in that direction. I guess the healthily skeptical part of me would say it's pretty rare for a business not to be tested at some point, even in an industry that is hot as data centers. And that moment will no doubt come for him, and then we'll really see what the management team and the board are made of. But so far, it's been a stunningly successful story.
Yeah. We recognised a few other business people of the year at the event. Which you just want to mention them. Ryan Stokes from Seven Group had a brilliant year. I like to say he's like our version of Warren Buffett because he's got Seven Group is a bet on Australia, like Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, is a bet on the US. Matt Common from CBA, not only for the stonking share price, but the way that they've just grown the business and the customer franchise.
Indeed.
Leah Weckett from Coles, bit of a controversial one given she's under fire from the ACCC, but she's super impressive and has done a great job in 18 months. Greg Goodman, also from Goodman Group, another data center company, and another tech set of tech stars, Melanie Perkins and Cliff Obrecht from Canva. But James, I mentioned before that you mentioned on the night, I should say, that it could be seen as a bit of a cop-out to have joint winners. But take us inside the judging process because it was absolutely agonising in a good way.
It sure was. So let's take a step back. The judges are myself, yourself, your fellow Chanticleer partner in crime, Anthony McDonald, Deputy Editor of Business, Kyla Lusikian, Cosima Mariner, our National Affairs columnist, Jennifer Hewitt, Companies Editor, Vesna Polyak, and Boss Editor, Sally Patton.
There's a lot of people to blame.
Yeah. Oh, you can see what I'm doing there, right? It's transparently obvious. But I'm also reading out the names to demonstrate to people that we take it very seriously.
Yeah,
so we
totally.
get together, everyone prepares a short list separately, and then we broadly agree on a handful of winners of Business Person of the Year. That's quite a long and detailed conversation, but where things tend to heat up is when we come to decide on an overall winner. And I'm relatively new to the job, so I can't speak to how it's happened in the past, but there was a very deep and constructive and division about whether we should give the main award to AirTrunk or whether we should give it to Chemist Warehouse. And as I said on the night, it could be seen to be a cop-out to go with both. I don't think the people that decided the 1995 Academy Awards had the luxury of saying we're going to give it to Pulp Fiction and Forrest Gump. They had to choose one of those. But one of the things that made it really tricky for us, James, and jump in when you want, was the businesses are very different in a lot of ways. One is a story of graft and toil and incremental growth over the best part of 5 decades in an industry, pharmacy, that is already established. And if you'd said to me back then, I'm going to build a $30 billion challenger to the pharmacy establishment, I would have said you're crazy. In much the same way, if you'd said to me, I'm going to build a $30 billion business in data centers, I would have said that's complete madness. So Cosimo, who's the editor, and I were a bit split. Yeah. You and Ant were split, and I remember calling Ant after the first meeting going, I'm not going to reveal who nominated who, but, you sure you're right? And he completely convinced me that he was right. Then I called you. You completely convinced me you were right. And in the end, we couldn't split it. And I think, as I said on the night, they're both having a moment this year. One had the sale, one is about to list on the ASX. Private and public, it's a nice contrast as well, by the way, as an aside. And we just felt it would be unfair to not give them the award this year. And so that's what it boiled down to. I think once the audience heard both of them speak and was able to digest it, I would say this, but I think there was an acceptance of the rationale, but it was a torturous process. And I felt, I don't think either of them really knew how it was going to play out on the evening. And I think they had a good idea that they were in the running for something. Yes. But I still had a sick sense in my stomach, even as it was being announced, because you kind of want it to work, but I think it did in the end. Do you agree?
No, I do. I think we got to the right decision because, as you say, they're sort of so different but very similar.
Yeah.
In that they're dynamic founders, both amazing immigrant stories.
Yes. Yep.
So I think there's sort of nice differences and nice symmetry, but I think in the end, your point is right. It just would have been unfair to rank one above the other. And so I don't think joint winners will be our standard policy.
I really hope not, James.
but this is a moment, and I think it was fair enough. And I reckon on the night, I'm with you. Even as they watched each other's different businesses and listened to each other speak, my sense was that they felt we're pretty lucky to be with these guys, and vice versa. So I don't know. I think it landed really well.
And the purpose of this event, I think it's important just to talk about that for a second, James, is to celebrate success. We live in a pretty cynical, ironic world at the best of times.
Yes.
And it's just a reminder that there is cause for optimism, that Australians can do amazing things. So to have these two businesses celebrated in this way, as I said, the road may be bumpy ahead of them for both companies at times, but they've done a really good job up to that moment. So it was nice to be in a room where there was just a genuinely constructive and happy vibe to the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And good to be able to bring a bit of that room to our listeners. All right, James, let's move to our second topic. And this week we got yet another set of tepid GDP figures that suggest we remain in a per capita recession, with the economy growing at just 0.3% in the September quarter and an annual rate of 0.8%. Now, right off the top, James, we're going to take a listener question, which is very much on this topic, from Jacob.
Yeah, g'day, Chooks. Jacob from Perth. My question today is regarding just a broad thematic with the Australian economy being the relationship between government spending and private investment, and the ever-increasing reliance on government spending to essentially prop up the national and state economies. So I was just interested to know, essentially, what is it going to take for the private sector to become more of a economic driver of growth, both at a state and federal level? Interested to know your thoughts. Cheers.
Jacob, I reckon Jim Chalmers would like to know the answer to your question too.
Totally.
James, this was a tough week for, your view of the economy, wasn't it?
Yeah, look, we've had the good news, James, with Business Person of the Year. Now we're going to move into the bad news, which is the economic outlook. I think Jacob's question / point was really well made. There's a number of ironies to the economic environment at the moment, and we had Jim Chalmers come out this week and call on the business sector, the private sector, to help out. One of the things that you, even more than me, have heard over not just recent months but recent years is that the huge amount of public spending that is, to a certain extent, keeping the economy running, along with immigration. Yep. It's always a little bit more complicated than that, but non-productive public spending's been a big part of the picture, has crowded out private investment, private activity, private innovation, private risk-taking, call it what you like. Yeah. It would be simple to sort of say, well, that's what business always says, but the numbers really do support that argument. So I think there was a quiet sigh of frustration among many business leaders when the Treasurer made these comments. And, you know, you spoke to a pretty senior CEO this week who I thought, I referenced it at the event on Wednesday, who I think sort of summed up the contradictions and the problems that we face heading towards this election next year really nicely. What did he have to say? Yeah, so his point was that think of the economy not just over the next 20 weeks, but think of it over the next 20 years, right? 10 to 15% of GDP is at risk, not because anyone's done anything wrong. It's just that China's economy is maturing, so they won't need as much of our iron ore. We're going through an energy transition, so we won't sell as much coal and LNG and other fossil fuels. So that's just the sort of facts of life. But we need to replace that 10 to 15%. Yeah, it's not going to come from the domestic economy because the domestic economy is too small. So it's got to come from export sectors. But how are we making our economy more competitive internationally? Very high tax rate, some industrial relations policies that don't exactly encourage flexibility. We've got lots of delays in planning and approvals, which the private sector hates. So what's the big picture here? I mean, it's tough to answer that though, James. I get that, but it's bloody important. Well, someone or a firm that had a crack at answering that, James, this week was the consulting business McKinsey, who put out a report or an analysis of productivity in Australia. And you and Anne have talked about productivity ad nauseum because it is required if you work at the AFR to talk about productivity ad nauseum, but also because it's really important. Like, I think productivity is heart of the problems that are facing the Australian economy at the moment. So McKinsey says business investment is at recession levels as Australia's productivity growth slumps to 30th out of 35 developed countries. And they're warning that declining living standards are now at national emergency levels. And that sounds a bit alarmist, but our economics correspondent, Michael Reid, who does some really good work with the numbers, put out a really interesting piece this week where he noted that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has stopped trying to make the case that Australians are better off now than they were 3 years ago, and that's going to have some pretty obvious implications for the campaign. Yep. But one of the really interesting facts or numbers that he put in his piece was that if you add rising mortgage interest repayments to individual taxes, households are devoting a record 22% of their pay to either paying their tax or servicing their home loan, and that is the highest it's ever been. And that's 22%. That is a huge amount. And so you've got this bubbling away. You've got an election coming, and the bias obviously has been to lean towards populist policies rather than lean towards budget repair. Yep. And then you have a business community crying out for measures that will improve productivity and solve some of the problems you mentioned earlier. It's a really hard knot to unpick. James, you're closer to politics than me. I keep getting told that the timing of the next federal election, it has to be done before May, but everyone says it's going to go earlier than that because the government doesn't want to have to present another federal budget. Is that your sense too? Broadly, I agree with that. I spoke to a couple of people before this because I assumed we would be talking about the election date, which is about as useful as talking about when the next interest rate cut is going to be. And I got three different answers from three different people. But the one thing people agreed with is that there's not a lot in the government going to another budget. They've had 2 surpluses. Obviously, the terms of trade has helped with that, but the obvious counter-argument to that is that more could have been done on the budget repair front to avoid what looks to be a long series of deficits stretching into the future. So that's something they would have to confront head-on if there was to be another budget. The other complicating factor is a WA election, early-ish next year as well. So there's a lot of people saying it's going to be April 12. A lot of people saying it might be late February. And they'll have to get their skates on if that's the case. But I don't think they're going to hang around, James. But this living standards stuff makes it really complicated. And then the one thing we haven't talked about, although I alluded to it before, are interest rates. And I think we've established on this podcast that your call from a little while ago is probably unlikely to be true.
It's not looking great.
Not looking great. I think that's a nice way to put it. And if anything, we're going to when the RBA does begin to cut, it will be well and truly after the next election, possibly many, many months after the next election. So that's not going to help the government either.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Well, either way, it's going to be a big start to the year for the AFR because election campaigns are going to be great fun to cover. All right, James, we're going to come back after the break and answer a big question. Will the RBA have a late Christmas present for us? Back in a sec. Well, welcome back. If you want to know more about what we're talking about today and a whole lot more, AFR subscribers can sign up to the Chanticleer newsletter at join.afr.com/Chanticleer. Every Friday, the newsletter pulls together the best Chanticleer columns from the week and delivers them straight to your inbox. Okay, James, few big things to look out for next week, and one is on Friday night, US job numbers. These have been bouncing around a bit. The job series in the US, like in Australia, is pretty messy. But the Federal Reserve would need to see some more weakening of the labour market if it's going to have any reason to cut interest rates later this month. I'm starting to think there's no more rate cuts coming in the US for a little while too.
I think that's right, James. I don't have much more to add. It's a pretty straightforward equation for them, but I think we're not going to see anything before Christmas.
And speaking of straightforward occasions, the RBA meets will announce their decision on Tuesday. There's absolutely no chance, is there, of a
Zero.
cut?
Absolutely none. I think the ground has been well prepared for this. The economic data is pretty clear. We haven't mentioned inflation today. We've mentioned everything else. It's still sticky. It's still partly impacted by some of that public spending that we've been talking about. And for reasons that are pretty obvious in the political arena, there's probably not going to be a huge amount of easing there either. So until that really sticky inflation starts to turn, and we're not seeing genuine evidence of that yet, we're not getting a rate cut.
No, absolutely. As we mentioned, this week our question was from Jacob from Perth. We did it earlier, but if you've got a question you want to send in, email us at chanticleer@afr.com. You can also send us a question in audio form. Just record a voice memo on your phone, include your name and where you're from, and send it through to us, as Jacob did. Well, James, it's been a great week for the Fin. I love events like this. I reckon, as you said, it's a tough year and a long year in business, but being able to celebrate the people who do awesome things for themselves and the country, it's really special, I reckon.
Yeah, I felt really lucky to be part of the Fin Review this week, James. I know that sounds a bit like a cliche, but it was a really nice moment. It brings the newsroom together. It brings the newsroom closer to some elements of the business community. Sometimes we spend our days holding them to account, but it's nice to celebrate the wins as well. It was a great night.
Well said, and thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks, James. Have a great Christmas.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week. If you like the podcast and you want to hear more, consider sharing or giving the podcast a review, as it helps other listeners find us. And don't forget to follow wherever you get your podcasts. At the Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business and power. For more, go to afr.com and you can subscribe to the Financial Review. The Daily Habit of Successful People at afr.com/subscribe. Chanticleer was hosted by me, James Thompson, and James Chessell, and it was produced by Alex Gow and Lap Fan. Our theme is by Alex Gow. The executive producer is Fiona Buffini.
The Australian Financial Review.